Hello, everyone. My name is Colleen Connolly. I am a Fulbright scholar. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a graphic designer, museum researcher, and Fulbright scholar. Today, I'm going to talk to you about my Fulbright Arts Research grant, the Gateway Project. If you're unfamiliar with the Fulbright Scholarship, the Fulbright US program funds American citizens to conduct research or teach English abroad. My grant is for 10 months in Taiwan, and it's June, so I'm beginning my 4th month. And this is not a just graduated from college thing. If anyone is interested in applying for a Fulbright grant, I would love to see more graphic designers out here. The Gateway Project advocates for greater access to multilingual exhibitions and resources for museum visitors. This is the blog that I've created to house project updates, interviews, and topic posts. There's also an Instagram for post notifications and pictures of my travel if you want to see that. The paper I wrote for the academic summit is titled The Rise of the Designer Diplomat and goes more in depth on how design can be used for cultural diplomacy, as well as being more Taiwan focused than this talk. This presentation is about how the role of museums as cultural diplomats in corporations create a necessity to include multilingual design in their exhibits and resources. This is a different perspective from the norms of museums needing multilingual design for public accessibility, although I love that conversation as well. It is often loaded with American cultural assumptions, so it's just not used in this talk. Here's the big picture. Let's put experienced designers at the forefront of multilingual design innovation and seeking opportunities for cross-cultural collaborations. If anyone walks away from this talk looking forward to working with more languages in your design practice, I'll be thrilled. So let's get started. How are museums cultural diplomats? In East Asia, it's not uncommon to see English incorporated into public spaces and historical tourist spots. I first became interested in this topic while I was studying Chinese language in Beijing and Dalian in college. This is the first time in my life that I experienced a language barrier in public. I noticed that English-Chinese exhibit labels were the norm in museums, and the effect of matching these two visually distinct typographic systems was striking and beautiful and sometimes a little strange, but I loved all of it. In a very meta sense, I can say that museums act as cultural diplomats because I'm living proof of it. I'm here talking at a conference because while abroad, I was able to experience the museums for myself without third-party translation. I was impressed by the exhibits, which then deepened my cultural understanding of the place. And now I'm telling you positive things about it. That is an example of soft power in real life, but it's not as scary as it sounds. Joseph Nye's broad explanation of soft power is the ability of a country to achieve national goals through persuasion or attraction. Soft power is often described in conjunction with cultural diplomacy as the exchange of ideas, information, art, and the other aspects of culture among nations and their people in order to foster mutual understandings. The fact that this definition sounds similar to the mission statements of many museums is not a coincidence in my eyes. So according to this definition of soft power, its success depends on its ability to persuade and attract, which is a tall order in today's attention deficit economy. This is where the designer diplomat is needed to create spaces that showcase the best that the culture has to offer. While diplomacy is not simply a public relations campaign, we all know this, well-designed public spaces and a compelling contemporary art scene are effective tools of cultural diplomacy. If you haven't read AIGA's design research publication, Design POV, it just came out last month, I highly recommend you take a look. This is a screenshot of page 9, a quote from Leland Mashmeyer, who had an interesting insight in comparing design to other academic spheres. He argues that design asks, what is desirable? If design is the practice of finding what is desirable, attractive, persuasive, then its role in museums design is connected to soft power. For museums, what is desirable is not only beautiful exhibitions, but also authentic connections to the public. This drive for authenticity directly affects our design decisions and can encourage opportunities to implement bilingual or multilingual design, especially when exploring other cultures. In my mind, nothing shows more authentic care for communities than communicating in their own language. So maybe you're thinking that while museums may attract international audiences, they are not actually diplomatic organizations. The Louvre isn't a direct arm of the French government. And you're right, but that's part of the appeal of authenticity. Museum researchers Natalia Grincheva argues that the separation between museum and state actually makes them more valuable as arbiters of culture when acting as non-state actors. Non-state actors do not have legal authority to represent their states, but they have international credibility and, even more valuable, trust from the public. While government diplomats must adhere to established channels, museums are much better positioned to establish closer ties with the public. So for non-state actors, their credibility is tied with their authenticity. Too much connection to any government can create suspicion of propaganda. While American museums are powerful examples of cultural diplomacy, we are inconsistent examples of accessibility. Since English is the current international lingua franca, most American institutions do not feel pressured to include consistent translations in their exhibits. In contrast, Taiwan, or the Republic of China, invests heavily in language translation, especially English. In 2018, the Executive Yuan of Taiwan declared a goal to have a bilingual nation by 2030, including expanding all linguistic accessibility in tourism. This language initiative is totally unique in the world. And it was my original intention for today's presentation. But when I got here in March, I realized that there is more nuance to this topic than I could reasonably be able to comprehend in a few weeks. So if you're interested, please feel free to do your own research and stay tuned to the Gateway blog. So how are museums corporations? So this is where the presentation differs from my published paper. And since this is a bit of a contentious idea in museum studies, everything here is my own opinion. The way contemporary museums engage with capitalism, such as the Guggenheim opening up franchises, is an example of the outsized pressure on these institutions to be profitable and be appealing, just like other brand name corporations. In creating museum brands, both museums and corporations copy off each other's papers, museums looking for economic practices and corporations wanting some authenticity or high cultural recognition. While museums collaborating with big brands such as BMW spell out disaster for some museum researchers, I am mainly concerned about the continuation of museum authenticity towards the public. There is an argument to be made that including more pop culture, blockbuster style exhibits is successful in attracting people who have never been to a museum before. But on the flip side, a heavy-handed branding exhibit can read just like propaganda, diminishing a non-state actor role. Perhaps no development in the art museum of the last half century has been more dramatic or controversial than the increase in commercialism. I saw this contention myself when I was working at museums. There were clashes between the curator's schedule and the finance office, and who had the higher priority, the museum mission or the museum's ability to pay the bills. So let's compare the National Palace Museum in Taipei to the K11 museums that are popping up all over China. The National Palace Museum in Taiwan, it has a fascinating connection with cultural diplomacy. It is by the numbers one of the most popular museums in the world, which houses nearly 700,000 priceless ancient Chinese artifacts. The exhibits are trilingual, Chinese, English, Japanese, and the audio tours and digital materials include 9 more languages. The Palace Museum artifacts all come from the original palace in the Forbidden City in Beijing. After the last emperor was run out and the Nationalist Party gained control of Beijing in 1928, the Nationalists had possession of these priceless artifacts. Years later, when the Nationalists lost the civil war against the Communist Party and fled to Taiwan, these artifacts came with them. Here, let me pause this video on the jadeite cabbage. This is the most popular object in the entire museum. Very quickly, all of these artifacts, they were put into this new museum and used as proof that the nationalists were the true Chinese government. So the nationalists sent exhibitions all over the world to convince other nations to back them in a new invasion of the mainland. Talk about cultural diplomacy through museum exhibitions. Of course, that means that today this museum is a political nightmare. The National Palace Museum won't send any of its objects on a traveling exhibition to mainland China for fear the CCP would seize the artifacts. And China has never asked for the objects back because that would imply Taiwan isn't a part of China. On top of that, the museum is a topic of heated discussion in Taiwan's domestic politics, where a growing number of people identify as Taiwanese and not Chinese. The Palace Museum is an obvious example of the past identity politics because it shows only the history of China to foreign visitors and not the history of the island. But the Palace Museum continues to be important to this day for the reason that it embodies this struggle of Taiwanese experience. I love this quote. Yes, the Palace Museum has been political for many years. Maybe this is the nature of museums, to reflect the politics of the societies that founded them. That's from the former director, Cho. So next up, let's talk about the billionaire art collector Adrian Chung's K11 brand and K11 Art Foundation. This is a picture of the original K11 Museum in Hong Kong, but now there are K11 franchises in Guangzhou, Shenyang, Shanghai, and Wuhan. K11 created the concept of museum retail in this fabulously high-end shopping mall art gallery experience. Mr. Chung's simple proposal was that the Chinese people love to visit shopping malls, and he wanted to introduce more regular people to fine art. So he blended a museum and a shopping mall to make it the place of culture that people would want to be at, while assuming that people would have been there anyway for the shopping experience. The K11 Art Foundation is a nonprofit run by Mr. Chung as well, and its mission is to support the development of Chinese contemporary art from Greater China by providing creative incubation platforms, which I think means giving artists residencies and gallery spaces in the mall. So again, we see cultural diplomacy in a museum mission. The rest of the museum world is embracing it. The K11 Art Foundation has collaborated with the ICA in London and the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, as well as many other international art groups. And Mr. Chung makes an interesting point here, where he refutes that people are very critical of his institutions by saying that many other museums around the world also engage in retail, museum retail. It's just not as obvious as his. Okay. So let's wind down, watch this very calming video. Let's wind down from uncovering how international relations and the global economy affect our museums. So from my perspective, these two museums represent the extreme of running a public nonprofit as a cultural diplomat or a capitalist retail space. Not all museums have these missions, but there are enough similar themes and conversations happening all over to make these two institutions very important to watch. Just as Director Cho said, museums reflect the politics of the people who made them, and experience design reflects the diversity of the people who use it. In museums and public spaces, designing for multiple languages could become a UX EGD industry standard. Just as of a few years ago, the expectation to design for both desktop and mobile changed the standard for the digital design world. Cultivating an excitement for multilingual design in our communities could open doors to cross-cultural collaborations and more inclusivity in our workplaces. As advocates for user-centered design, experience designers should embrace this change with open arms and open type kits. Big thank you to SEGD as well as my affiliate here, Furen Catholic University, this amazing book. Thank you.